So, thank you very much, Kees, for organizing this event. Thank you very much to all of you for still being interested in the welfare state. And as I will try to make clear in my presentation, I think that the future of the European welfare state is very much entangled with the question of how we should do research on the future of the welfare state, because there's basically a very important puzzle and relevant puzzle that is motivating, I think, at least my research agenda increasingly, and I think also of many other people. And this puzzle is that we've seen quite a lot of increasing inequality in many OECD countries in the last years and decades, but in many ways we have seen rather limited or muted response by policymakers to this increase in inequality. And as you know, the standard models in political economy on the welfare state, I'm just mentioning Maurizio, but there could be many others that are going in a similar direction. They would lead us to expect that at some point the state should respond to increasing inequality by doing something about it. And there are, of course, also historical examples. I'm thinking of the Industrial Revolution that was the birth event of the welfare state, where this mechanism actually happened. So something seems to be going on here, and I think the future of the welfare state depends very much on its continued legitimacy to do the job, so to do something about these social risks, these social problems. And if the welfare state doesn't react to these new demands and the new social risks that are associated with changes in the economy, then at some point there might be developments, and we are already starting to see the contours of this in many countries, such as widespread opposition to tax increases, welfare chauvinism, the rise of welfare state populism, if you want to call it like that. And so I think the future of the research on welfare state should really try to understand what's going on, try to understand the mechanisms, how socioeconomic demands are transferred into policy making, and which types of policies are more effective in mitigating inequality than others. And I think this is a term that I've been trying to use for a couple of years now. To develop an integrated approach to policy analysis is important here, and integrated means that in the social sciences we often have a little bit of a strange division of labor, where economics and sociology is often in charge of analyzing the impact of certain policies on socioeconomic outcomes, so the impact of education policy on social inequality, but they don't really look at the political process behind education reforms, and to use that example. And otherwise, political science is usually very much interested in understanding the origins of reforms, but usually doesn't really look at the impact of policies. And I think we need to put these two pieces of the puzzle together to get a full understanding of how this whole feedback mechanism, how the policy cycle in its entirety works. And at the moment, I think if you look at the puzzle that I'm pointing out here, we don't fully understand how these different elements of the policy feedback mechanism are connected. So why is this not happening? And yeah, you could call it the Fermi Paradox of social sciences. I don't know whether there are any other science fiction nerds in the room except me, but what the hard sciences call the Fermi Paradox is that if there should be other civilizations out there in the universe, why are they not here on Earth to visit us? And so in a way, this is a little bit like this. I think, why don't we see reactions to changing inequality in the way that we would expect if you look at functionalist theories? And you know the old functionalist theories, I mentioned Maurizio, but you might also go back to Walensky's work on the socioeconomic school in the 70s, 60s. But I think that we're also seeing more recent versions of this in the work of scholars like Busemeyer and Philip Rehm, who basically postulate that at some point the welfare state will react to changes in public opinion, which are by themselves also reflecting changes in the socioeconomic demands. But I think why it is not happening, you have to look at the different elements here, and I'm going briefly through these different parts, these different elements of the policy cycle: preferences and perceptions, mobilization, responsiveness of policymakers, and also finally ineffectiveness of policies themselves. And I think we already have some research on each of those, but at the moment it's not really well connected, and we don't really know how important the different elements really are. So starting with perceptions, you could say that there might be normative perspectives, normative arguments to be made here, that simply people in different cultures might have different tolerances for inequality. So in an individualistic culture like the US-American one, people agree with the higher levels of inequality than in a more egalitarian culture. And actually, there's also some evidence, and this can change over time. There's a recent paper by Grasso et al. In the British Journal of Political Science. It's called Blair's Babies and Thatcher's Children, and basically it looks at how the government policies of the different UK governments have impacted, influenced, and shaped the attitudes and preferences of younger generations who grow up under these policies. And so you can see that culture is not something that doesn't change over time, but it actually can change over time depending on the policy. And of course, we look at this from the policy feedback perspective in recent years. So this is the normative side, but there might also be a cognitive side to perceptions. There is some evidence, but it's not a lot, but there is some evidence that people over or underestimate their relative position in the income distribution just from a cognitive perspective. And actually what you find is that people in the lower half, they overestimate their position, so they think they are richer than they actually are. And people in the upper half of the income distribution, they tend to underestimate their position. They think they are less rich than they actually are. And overall, this compresses the perceived distribution of income and limits overall demand for redistribution. So in terms of perceptions, these might be explanations for why we don't see, or why we see a rather muted response to inequality. And then going from perceptions to preferences to what people actually demand from the state, of policymakers. We, and Silja is probably going to talk a lot more about this, we have now much research that shows that we don't simply have a one-dimensional dimension of redistribution that partisan competition is centered on, but we have at least two dimensions, maybe even more. And some of these issues that load highly on the second dimension might distract voters, so to speak, from their true economic preferences. And I'm thinking about issues such as migration in the US. The abortion topic is very prominent, and so this might mean that many people are distracted from their purely economic preferences by parties that mobilize specifically on these non-economic issues. That could also be an explanation for why we don't see such a strong response to rising inequality than we would expect. Political mobilization is the next stage. So even if people want redistribution, why don't they mobilize to get it? So there are two competing theories in the literature. One is rooted in conflict theories, where you would say if you have economic grievances, that should lead at some time to protest, uprising, mobilization. And if you think back about how the welfare state was born, and that's exactly what happened during the Industrial Revolution. You see union movements forming, you see social democratic parties forming, and so that's, historically speaking, something that had already happened before. But there are other theories, and I just call them resource-based theories, that are arguing that inequality in economic resources is also associated with political inequality, in the sense that if you have fewer economic resources, you are also less likely to participate. So it has a depressing effect. Economic inequality depresses political participation of those with few resources. And actually, in the literature, there's more evidence for the second thesis rather than the first thesis, but we don't really understand why is that the case. Why do we see this kind of muted response, whereas we had big-scale reactions to rising inequality in the historical period? Of course, there's a recent twist to this argument. We see developments in the US, in the UK, maybe also Poland, Hungary, where you have some mobilization, but it's going on in completely unexpected ways because it's not support for the traditional welfare state parties, but we see support for new forms of right-wing populism, often also connected with this new notion of welfare chauvinism, where right-wing populist parties actually use welfare state policies to mobilize also on the second dimension with regard to migration issues. Then finally, responsiveness of policymaking. Even if you have preferences, demand for redistribution, if you have parties mobilizing for it, there might also be a lot of reasons why policymakers don't react to this, either because they are there are some deficiencies that are already happening within the process of representation. There's a lot of work on this from the United States, Marty Gillens and many others. Increasingly some work for Europe as well, where people look at whether preferences of the poor are equally represented among policymakers. But there are also external constraints of policymakers, so that even if they want to do something, they might not be able to do this as much redistribution as they would like to. And I personally have also worked a little bit on the link between globalization and the welfare state, and I do find that it's increasingly difficult for governments to make use of the limited leeway that they have in a globalized and Europeanized economy. So in a way, there might be external constraints that limit policymakers to actually do something about this. And here it's also important to keep in mind the distinction between responsive and responsible policymaking. Sometimes there might be good reasons why policymakers are not immediately responsive to public concerns, because they might be more concerned about long-term policymaking. I'm going to skip the next one, but just briefly to conclude, I think understanding how all these mechanisms are connected is really the challenge for future research on the welfare state, and I think it's also a challenge for the future of the welfare state, because if we don't really understand where the problem is, then we cannot really do something about it. And my personal opinion, if I would have to make a judgment on which of these mechanisms is the most important one, I would say that you have some mechanisms in each of these stages, so that there's mobilization going on issues that are not directly related to economic policies. There's some perceptions that are cognitively and normatively biased. But I would say the biggest problem is probably on the policy-making stage, where you have a limited responsiveness of policymakers, which is to a large extent related to the fact that we of course still have the problem that the welfare state is for the most part confined to the national level, and much of these problems are happening at the European level or even at the global level. Thank you.
When Kees invited us all to talk about the future of the welfare state, I mean, he had the actual object in mind, the welfare state, and Marius just reflected on the research on the welfare state, and I mean, I had the same response. So maybe it's a bad habit, but anyway, because I mean, when you think about what is the future of the welfare state, it's like asking the question, what's the future of the fire brigade? And my answer would be, it depends on the fire. If the fire is big, you need a lot of resources, and if not, maybe less so. So what I want to talk about is 4 things. First, I want to reflect on the field where we are. And then I want to say something about how we as scholars deal with welfare state change. And I think we're not there yet. And then I go through a little bit of the literature, and I want to present a research puzzle that is sort of like, it obsesses me, and I want to do research on it in the future, and that's called Well-Being Returns on Social Investment. And Kees already mentioned, I just published a book about it. I think the field of comparative welfare state analysis, and it's not just political science, is really unique in the sense that it is widely and intensely collaborative. There's people from political science, sociology, they work together, qualitative, quantitative, and what have you. And that's really something to be immensely proud of. It also creates something of a puzzle. Why is it so? Why do these sociologists, quantitative and qualitative political science, why do they like each other so much? And I think that has to do with the fact that, and this goes back to Polanyi, although this is cast in doubt by somebody like Wolfgang Streeck, is that the welfare state makes modern capitalism compatible with democracy. And maybe we see the end of it, maybe not. We'll talk about it later. And I think over the years, all the research that has been done on the quantitative side has kind of showed that there really is no big trade-off between equity and efficiency. I mean, that's sort of the neoliberal affront to the welfare state. It's just simply not true, although people do believe it, and also politicians do believe it. But it all depends, and the devil is in the detail, on the policy design and also the flexibility of the welfare state in the face of structural change. I mean, in the literature, we talk a lot about the resilience of the welfare state, but often we mean different things. I mean, for Paul Pearson, resilience of the welfare state is the immobility of the welfare state. For me, it's much more the adaptability of the welfare state. And of course, all the policies we talk about, family, work, welfare, redistribution, they're highly normatively charged. But it's also important to emphasize when we look at the welfare state as sort of a policy structure, it's not, I mean, it's not really about the good life. It's an ameliorative institution that tries to mitigate social risk and not resolve them once and for all. So back to the puzzle. There's a lot of literature that sort of is now moving in a direction of trying to understand changes. And I think, the most bold expression is, it goes back to Paul Pearson, and I think he's changed his mind about it a little bit on the US case, where he says, basically the new politics of the welfare states are the politics of the status quo, and that's because of, politicians want to shift blame and they don't dare to really do the tough reforms. And often he uses, in some of his recent articles, spending indicators that kind of show, stability, since the 1980s, even going up in recent years. So, the welfare state simply doesn't move. Well, I guess we all can agree there's simply too much reform, in family policy, in pension policy, whatever you can. It's just simply not true. So that is kind of falsified. Then there is this new literature that comes from, this kind of school of thought, and I think we're all trained in that, that says, well, maybe it's more gradual, and then it's transformative in the long run. And Kathy Thielen and Wolfgang Streeck have worked on this. But when you look at their empirical work, it's often they have these mechanisms like layering and conversion, but the empirics is all about policy drift and about dualization. It's all about sort of, a slow depletion of the effectiveness of interventions. And I think what Marius just presented is sort of, what you can call the new partisan politics of the welfare state that kind of moves in a direction, say, okay, let's move away from the institutional supply side of understanding, where the welfare state is going to, and then, look at, the societal demand dimension of preferences and what's going on there. It may be consistent with the demand side, with the supply side, but nevertheless, it's interesting to look at that. Although in some of Marius' work, there's a rudimentary tension between new and old social risk, where I don't think that's right. I think if you invest in children, you actually save pensions in the long run. So there is no contradiction between, social investment kind of policies and old social insurance kind of policy. But for me, I think I'm in between those generations. I tend to sort of try to think a little bit more about bringing the state back in again. Because there's a very important literature on the welfare state at the beginning in the 1970s and 1980s that says, we really need to look at the state structures. And this was at a time when, spending levels of GDP in social spending were far less than 20%. Today, they're in between 25 and 30%. So, if you think about public administration, next year, they have to make sure they have a resource of, 20 to 30% of GDP to spend on the welfare state. And you have to balance the book. So I think the administrative side is very important, and not just the political side, and not just the redistributive side, because, the welfare state for 75% is about social insurance. So I would like to bring the state back in. And I'm triggered by this sort of very simple statistic. I was kind of shocked when I first started to look at this a couple of years ago, that although we all know that the US crisis response was much more aggressive with quantitative easing and, and many other interventions. So you would think that, compared to Europe, where we kind of pushed austerity down our throats, you would expect, employment losses in the wake of the crisis to be much larger in Europe than the US. And in fact, it's the opposite. So the US were already on a downward slope. I don't know who remembers the sort of the job study of the OECD, which basically says, as American levels of employment are so much higher than Europe has to get its act together by retrenching the welfare state. That was the simple message. And so this is, a counterfactual that we need to try to explain. And it's reflected also in spending levels of the welfare state. So here you see that, countries that do spend a lot on the welfare state, they also tend to have high rates of employment, with two very important critical exceptions, and that is Italy and France. And this is where, something has to move, I would think, but, we can talk about it later. So this brings me to something of a political explanation, which is sort of a hypothesis that I would like to work on more in the future, and that is, if it's true, as Paul Pearson and many others have said, that actually, welfare states are very, very difficult to retrench. Maybe that difficulty in the high-spending welfare states have acted in the past as a productive constraint, pushing policymakers, and that's not only parties in government, but also the administration and epistemic communities, to refocus on other policies, these new social investment policies that I'm going to talk about later, to layer upon reformed and existing social insurance buffers in order to secure the carrying capacity of the welfare state. And basically, the carrying capacity of the welfare state is a bit like socialism within one class. It's the workers who finance the welfare state through taxes and contributions. What is important is how that money is being spent. So that brings me to the social investment perspective, and Kees has to interrupt me when I'm sort of over my 10 minutes already. Almost 10 minutes. Then I just do this slide and the next one, just to round off. So what is social investment? Social investment in the knowledge economy, in aging societies where human resources are becoming scarce, is about raising the quality of human capital stock and capabilities over the life course, from the young to the old, and there are cumulative returns. The more you invest in the young, the more productive the old become. With the participation of women in the labor market, there's also the need to work on the flow dimension of contemporary labor market transitions by improving the flow of labor market input over the life cycle until old age. And that's something different than thinking about flow as deregulation. And I think a very important insight that goes back to the book that I was involved in with Gösta Esping Andersen is to, in these times where more volatile life courses, universal social security buffers are extremely important. So it's not like the third way. We should do stock and flow and forget about the buffers. But the devil, as I said before, is really in the institutional detail, in the detail of the institutional complementarities, how stocks, flow, and buffers work together. That's really where the difficulty is, and I can't develop that. I only can develop this notion of a social investment life course multiplier, and the aggregate statistics, show the multiplier. We still have to write out the function. So the more countries, and this is where some European countries in the vanguard, invest in early childhood, the higher the levels of educational attainment. The higher the levels of educational attainment, the higher the employment rates. The more there are dual earner family balance policies, the higher the employment rate once more. And also this is where young couples may reach their aspirational levels of fertility. If that is sort of ratcheted up with active aging and some kind of pension reform on the buffers, it's not easy, but has to be done, you get a higher exit age and also a higher employment rate of the elder, and probably also higher longevity. That means if the life course multiplier works properly, at the end of the day, you have more resources for poverty prevention and inequality mitigation. Now, this is, putting all the numbers together. But if we go back to the reality, this is where you have to think about the institutional complementarities of these stocks, flows, and buffers. And I can't sort of develop that, but that is really where the difficulty lies. It's not in the theory per se. Thanks very much.
So, I would like to talk about the one context condition that I think is most consequential for welfare state politics and the welfare state in this first half of the 21st century, and that is changing electoral politics. The change that I refer to here is the emergence in most Western democracies of a second dimension of programmatic electoral competition between universalist, internationalist positions and particularist, traditionalist, nationalist political positions. And over the past decades, this second dimension has become the dominant dimension of electoral competition in most Western European countries. There are countless studies on this. I mention a few of them on the slide. So when you think of the US presidential election between Trump and Clinton, when you think of the Austrian presidential election earlier this year between Van der Bellen and Hofer, FPÖ versus the Greens, when you think of the French election, Macron versus Le Pen, these are all elections which opposed the two polar opposites of this second dimension. Positions in favor of internationalism versus nationalism, cultural liberalism versus traditionalism, universalism versus particularism. And I think one could say that these were probably among the first elections that fully mobilized and revolved around this realigned structure of conflict. So they may well be kind of the new normal in West European politics in this day and age. So of course, there is a debate about what this second dimension exactly is, if it's one dimension or not, what issues are attached to it. But what is very clear in all this literature is that it is a dimension that is not primarily about the welfare state, not primarily about redistribution, about the level of taxation. And that is, I think, the reason why political economy and welfare state research has quite long neglected this second dimension and this electoral realignment. And we kept carrying on as if Western democracies and electorates were still structured along income classes that align on a single left-right dimension over how much to extract from the rich and redistribute to the poor. But I think today we cannot really neglect this second dimension anymore, or label it as noise or de-alignment or populism or other labels which kind of imply that these are expressions of confused voters who are maybe angry, disoriented, etc. But I think that that's really the structure of programmatic political competition in Western democracies today. So, and now I start talking about the welfare state, even if the second dimension is not primarily about the welfare state, I think it's high time that we think through what its dominance and what its importance in current politics implies for the welfare state. And I would like to do so along 3 lines. First, what it may imply for the politics of the welfare state, what it implies for the agenda, for the substantive agenda of the welfare state reform, and then final thoughts on the study of the welfare state. So first, the politics. This restructuring of democratic electoral competition in Europe is the consequence of massive electoral realignment in party electorates. I show you here a graph that came out in an article together with Jane Gingrich 2 years ago on this electoral realignment and welfare state politics. And what the graph shows you is the changing class composition of voters of left-wing pro-welfare state parties. So, and it's categorized along the 4 groups that we usually think of when we do welfare state research: social democratic, Christian democratic, liberal, and southern regimes. And what you see is that in all these regimes, the share of middle-class voters in the pro-welfare state party electorate has increased massively at the expense of the working-class electorate. And part of that, of course, is just structural change with occupational upgrading, etc. But part of it is also real realignment. And so the probability of a middle-class voter to vote left is much higher. It's about 20 percentage points higher today than it was 30 years ago. So this is a massive shift. What does that mean for the politics of the welfare state? It means that the actors that we work with, that we focus on when we study the welfare state or when we think about the way the welfare state is debated and reformed, these actors are not the same anymore. Social democratic parties have, in all Western democracies, become middle-class parties in the sense that the vast majority of their voters are middle-class voters, to different extents, of course, but the picture is generally the same across countries. And right-wing parties, especially populist right-wing parties or nationalist right-wing parties, have an increasing share of working-class voters. That means mainly 2 things in terms of politics of the welfare state. It means that just the number of left seats in parliament or in government doesn't mean much anymore. I mean, the variables that we used to work with don't mean much as such anymore. We need to connect the power of different parties to the actual electorates that they represent. And second, it means that there are probably new and different and evolving coalitional possibilities for the parties whose electorate is changing so much, with middle-class left-wing voters being quite pivotal because they can ally either with liberal moderate right parties or with working-class parties when it comes to discussing welfare state issues. What does the realignment of European electoral politics imply for the substantive agenda of welfare state reform? I think the most straightforward answer, and there are a lot of papers on this topic here at the conference, is the rise of welfare chauvinism, that we would expect welfare chauvinism to become very prominent. Welfare chauvinism obviously becomes an issue in many countries, but if you think of it, it's actually not that prominent yet. Even in party programs, also in government policies, that has a lot to do with coalitional dynamics, with the coalitional options that these right-wing populist parties have or don't have. But beyond welfare chauvinism as kind of the most obvious expression of a combination of distributive and cultural policy positions, there are many more and much increasingly many policies are framed and understood in terms of this second dimension politics. And there is increasing evidence on this that is starting to come out. For instance, I mentioned 3 examples here. For instance, in a chapter that I wrote with Hans-Peter Kriese, we found that attitudes on deservingness and welfare state misuse, so whether people extract too much or whether it makes people lazy, etc., these attitudes correlate strongly with your attitudes on the cultural dimension, not on the economic left-right dimension. In his recent PhD thesis, Carlo Knott found that attitudes on sanctioning, conditionality, what unemployed people should be asked to do in order to receive the benefits, that correlates strongly with authoritarian values, not with attitudes on redistribution and welfare state generosity. And probably most prominently, and that's where my talk links to Anton's talk on social investment, we find increasingly, and Marius has found that with his data across several countries, that social investment policies, attitudes of individuals, positions of political parties on social investment policies, early childhood, childcare facilities, education investments, care policies, etc., attitudes and positions on these policies correlate strongly with attitudes on the second dimension. So that means that whether you think childcare services should be expanded has a lot to do with what you think about the rights of migrants or women, but not so much to do with what you think about the level of pensions should be in a country. This is why I think, so the fact that social investment loads so clearly on the second dimension, and the fact that the second dimension is so relevant in many European countries, is the reason why I think that social investment will be the welfare state conflict and the welfare state topic in this first half of the 21st century. In the extreme, it can oppose a middle-class social investment state that invests in the most productive, high-skilled, skilled women that go in the workforce and their children, etc. So invest in the productive parts of the workforce, generate productivity and gains, which can then be used to finance kind of a redistributive security for the less productive parts of the workforce. That would be kind of one end of the extreme, versus a position in favor of a dualized protectionist welfare state that preserves the benefits of past beneficiaries at the expense of migrants, outsiders, and investment. So that would be kind of an extreme version. And in that version, of course, in such a scenario, it would really divide the left and endanger the welfare state. But of course, that doesn't have to be the case. Social investment can be inclusive and universalist, and I think that's the kind of social investment that Anton speaks about when he kind of draws the virtuous circle of social investment. So in principle, it could also be that the social investment saliency allows for a coalition in favor of a universalist way of social investment. Because the electoral realignment in principle enlarges the pro-welfare state basis in the electorate, right? You have the working class that is still clearly pro-redistribution, at the same time a new middle class, growing new middle class that is also pro-welfare state. And so the final point I will briefly talk about is, going forward, is what is the impact of the way we study welfare state politics. And it follows up on what I said last. Electoral realignment has actually enlarged the pro-welfare state basis. Because this new middle class also kind of joined the pro-welfare state parties for different reasons, but now they are, supporting these parties. The welfare state itself has, of course, also contributed this via the feedback effect. But when you look today at both micro-level data and partisan data on support for the welfare state, you find very broad and increasing support, sometimes almost consensus. I show you here a graph from the same article with Jane Gingrich, where we look at the pro-welfare state mentions in party manifestos for different party families, minus the anti or the contra-welfare state mentions in these manifestos. And what you see, basically, it's not at all kind of a decline in the support of the welfare state, but quite the contrary across party families. Stable or even increasing support of the welfare state. And if you look at individual level data, it's even much more extreme. I show you this graph. This is for all the West European countries, the share of people in the ISSP survey who think that pensions and education spending should be either maintained or expanded. You see it's basically unanimity in the survey. Nobody wants to retrench or cut this spending. So there is a very large support for the welfare state. But of course, the question is what this seeming agreement or consensus, especially at the level of citizens, hides, and what that means for politics in a time where resources are scarce. And I would argue that what sets citizens apart is not so much their position, as we see here, it's what kind of priorities they have in welfare state politics. So despite being generally favorable to different welfare state policies, they may not attribute the same weight to different policies, and the question then is, what kind of benefits do they defend most, where are cuts opposed most, etc. And I think that is something that welfare state research may want to focus on in order to kind of rethink the welfare state conflict in an era where both the electoral arena and also welfare state politics are quite largely realigned. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I am going to shift a little bit the focus from the domestic arenas and domestic social policies to the EU, which has been mentioned a couple of times, but not squarely addressed as a polity in the making, which may require its own degree and aspect of redistribution and social solidarity. And the title of my presentation highlights the need which I see of reconciling at the EU level the two spheres, the economic and the social sphere. Now, if we look at the history of the European welfare state, especially in the larger countries, then we note a quite crucial development that took place in some moments early on, and which was extremely important in terms of social politics. The weakening of territorial conflict, redistributive territorial conflicts, and the parallel strengthening of functional conflicts. So there was a shift from cross-functional territorial conflict constellation towards a cross-local or cross-territorial functional conflict constellation. For example, when the class conflict became the dominant and prevailing line of conflict around almost everything in the 20th century, but especially around the building of the welfare state. And it was precisely the downplaying, even the disappearance, at least in overt forms of the territorial juxtapositions and conflicts that allowed for that nationalization of the citizenry, as Steinrocken called it, and a culture of national solidarity that could develop and that could reinforce over time the further development of nation-based systems of solidarity and redistribution. Now, this sequence was, of course, delayed in the historical federations. The nationalization of social protection occurred later in the US or in Switzerland. And in these systems, the territorial dimension of redistribution was never totally collapsed into the functional dimension, but at least it could be politically managed. Now, in the last couple of decades, or even 3 decades, we have started to witness a reversal of this long-term historical trend. First, the reappearance within domestic arenas of territorial conflicts. For example, between regions, with the emergence of neo-regionalist parties, the Lega Nord in Italy, for example, voicing explicitly against the territorial distributive status quo and advancing territorial claims once again. But the real interesting trend is more recent and has to do with the emergence of that new dimension that was mentioned by Silja before, which is called the integration demarcation dimension. She has called it in a different way, but it's basically, you know, an us against the others, us against them. And this, of course, is a territorial, or can be seen as a territorial conflict that pits national people or national citizens or nationals against outsiders, against non-nationals when they come into their supposed homes, national homes, on or where issues of cross-national redistribution start to emerge. And as it has been shown and argued, the process, not only globalization, but more specifically European integration, has been a robust trigger of this new line of conflict. Now, Silja has briefly discussed the implications of this for political domestic arenas. Let me try to make some remarks about the implications for the EU as a polity in the making. Now, given precisely the presence of entrenched and large domestic social protection systems, nobody would have expected the EU to be able to embark on a process of social federalization. As I said, it was already difficult in the historical federations, and it may be even impossible for the EU as such. This was the famous impossibility theorem that was formulated already in the 70s by Steinrock. He said once the national populations, national voters, have been nationalized through welfare democracy, then it is very difficult, if not impossible, to actually Europeanize or internationalize solidarity beyond the control of national populations. So this is, I mean, nobody would have had high expectations about that. But, and this is my contention, I think that at this stage at least, the EU cannot survive politically if some sort of a modicum, a minimum degree of cross-territorial solidarity is actually achieved, activated somehow. Now, if we look at the conflict constellation of the European political space, we see quite clearly that there are 4 lines of conflict. You know, the first one, which is now become not very salient and visible, you know, it's left-right at the EU level. What should be the mission of the European Union? You know, a Euro-liberal versus a Euro-social program or vision for the EU. But then, especially during the crisis, 2, which are essentially territorial lines of conflict, have emerged, a core periphery, north-south, around issues of cross-territorial transfers, and an east-west conflict around the issue of free movement. And these 2 types of conflict are together linked and cumulate in giving rise to a more general integration, demarcation, or integration national autonomy conflict. So my fear is, and there are a lot of politicians, but also some colleagues that formulate pessimistic scenarios about this, is that the explosion of these territorial conflicts at a relatively early stage of EU building, if we can use this expression, is going to backlash against the very process of EU building. So that's why we hear people writing books on Europe is doomed, just to mention the title of the book by my friend Ian Zilonkas, or people that, in a more deterministic or structuralist theoretical perspective, like Wolfgang Streeck, for example, say it is not possible, to move ahead. Now, I must say that I am less inclined to share this perspective, and I tend to think that the future is open, or has a part of possibilities that actors can take advantage of. They can, opportunities are always present in the historical constellations, but they can also be created by actors, especially by leaders, right? But I want to concentrate now, I want to give you some data, because I think that the situation is less pessimistic, less discomforting also on the demand side. So there is more potential on the demand side for the construction of that modicum of cross-territorial solidarity, at least in attitudinal terms, than we normally think. And I'm going to show you a couple of tables because I don't have time. But I draw the data from a recent survey that I have conducted in the context of a project that is called Reconciling Economic and Social Europe, on 6 European countries: Germany, France, Italy, Poland, Spain, Sweden, and then the UK, although for the UK we had to use a different questionnaire after Brexit. And here I have some brochure about the survey which I leave on the table, but if you cannot or don't want to get the flyer, then on the website of my project you can download the full report and the questionnaire. And it's a lot of questions on trying to tap the potential for solidaristic orientations or policies on the side of respondents, of representative samples in the 6 countries. I skipped some tables because I just don't have time. I just want to show you this, which is, to some extent, gives you the summary picture. We have tapped, after a number of questions that cued respondents about the fact that we were interested in establishing how much solidarity we were ready to actually express and sustain vis-à-vis other member states or other nationals. We tested 4 different images of the EU. On a dimension more demanding in terms of solidarity and cohesion to less demanding. So the most demanding one was the EU is a common home. Now we had in mind the Nordic image of the Folkhemmet, the welfare state as the house of the people, okay? And as you can see, about a quarter, I was surprised, I thought it was less, about a quarter of respondents opted for this option. Italy was the country that supported this option to a greater extent. Germany was about 12%, I think. Then the apartment building image. We had in mind the Weberian idea of a community of neighbors. So neighbors are jealous of their own apartment, of their own privacy. But since they live in the same apartment and know that they are exposed to some common risks, they are prepared to pool some resources to face possible common adversities based on reciprocity, basically. But they also have some basic benevolence. You know, if somebody knocks at the door, if your neighbor knocks at the door with an emergency, you help him or her. So that's the image of the apartment building, which is the image which has the greatest support, especially in Germany, as you see. Then there is a less demanding image, you know, the European Union basically as a commons, you know, as a common ground that facilitates transactions and economic exchanges, 26%, and then a sinking ship, okay? And of course, the highest number of respondents that supported this view was in the UK. So I was a little bit, I was positively surprised by this. I thought that we wouldn't get so much support for the more solidaristic options. But I was even more surprised when we started to test potential support for a number of possible measures at the EU level to actually facilitate or even fund cross-territorial transfers. I cannot really comment on each of the graphs, just show you the other one. So we tested a number of proposals. Some of them are on the agenda, and we were really surprised to find such high degree of support. Now, let me immediately respond to a criticism that people immediately raise when I show this. You didn't ask them if they were prepared to pay, okay? But is that really necessary? I mean, it really depends on how you frame the issue. You don't necessarily have, when people are exposed to proposals on the side of the government or on the side of political parties, and the parties propose measures, they do not come there immediately with a table that specifies who exactly is going to pay how much, right? So there is a leeway, there are margins of maneuvers on the side of policymakers to actually emphasize the measures without necessarily being too specific with the costs. Bottom line is, I'm not denying that there is Euroscepticism, that there is a lot of anxiety and insecurity about the impact of integration, that there is this increasingly salient integration demarcation divide. But I think that we can say that there is a potential silent majority out there that can be activated with appropriate, perhaps framing cues, with appropriate politics. Okay, we need to devise a politics that suits this kind of policies. And let me just finish with this, because the other question that I get is, well, who might do it? We need ideas. We need visions. Nobody's really now talking about, cross-territorial solidarity. I gave this presentation at the Trade Union Congress in Brussels, and when I said that for me, social Europe is not just a system that allows member states to defend what they have, but it's also a system in which there is a modicum of cross-territorial, cross-national solidarity, and they looked at me as if I was mad. Okay, they were not prepared to even discuss this. And then, of course, responsible leaders capable of forging a coalition of member states. And the keys for this, I think, is in the hands especially of Germany. Let me just leave this on the screen. Mario Draghi, in a recent speech, perceived the silent majority, commenting on the French and the Dutch elections.
I would now first like to ask the Roundtable members if they have any response to the presentations.
Silja?
Yeah, thank you. I will be brief, but I think what is actually telling is that, so we all four of us got the assignment to speak about the future of the European welfare state. We also got the abstract that you may have read in the program of the roundtable, and you will have, if you have, you will have noticed the gap between the abstract and what you've heard, because the abstract had this narrative of there's the Great Recession and there is austerity, and is there a future for the welfare state? Can the welfare state survive, etc.? And none of us have spoken on about welfare politics in these terms, and I think and we do welfare state research all the time, so it's really just not, it's not what we see when we look at the welfare state. Rather, I mean, the context, and of course the context for many welfare states is difficult, but it brings about different ways in which the welfare state can be developed, which, and I think that's kind of the point where the two of us probably disagree a little bit, is I would say each of these directions in which the welfare state can go entails cuts or retrenchment for some people and benefits or gains for other people. And so it's not black and white. It's not retrenchment or survival of the welfare state, but even the social investment paradigm, I think one has to be really careful. It can be. Its effects can be very good, but only for the middle class, and then it may even increase inequality and not contribute to social solidarity, of course. And the same with welfare chauvinism, of course. Maybe even the European social model, right, entails winners and losers. So I think the way we see the welfare state is really more in terms of who wins and who loses, instead of the overall future of the welfare state as such.
Anton?
Yeah, just a response. I think we are in agreement a little bit behind this table, so I would like to hear your opinion. But two things I think are important in what we observe. I mean, it's not. I mean, Marius talked about inequality, and inequality is, becoming, the salient new definition of the welfare state where it has to move. It used to be full employment in the Beveridge and Keynesian era. So the focus was every time there's a recession, you have to do something about, regaining full employment. And I think inequality hasn't really sunk in the way it should. But if you look at the numbers, I mean, inequality is very different across Europe. So we should not sort of, jump too much on the Piketty train here. What I think what I do observe, because these days I also do sort of local level research on welfare state. I mean, I have this sense, and it has to do with globalization and European integration, the things that Maurizio talked about. There is this metaphor. I think it's from cycling. It's called in Dutch. It's called a valsplat. And it means that, you think you're cycling on a flat course, but actually it's going up, and you don't realize it, but you feel it in your muscles that you can't get ahead. And so my sense is, we spend as much on the welfare state than ever before, but the welfare state is working so hard on all levels, and there is, there's a maybe something can happen and maybe not. I'm on the optimistic side because I don't believe in jobless growth, and countries that are on the sort of the advantage on the micro on sort of computer dimension. I mean, they have the most jobs, so it's not. I mean, jobless growth. Maybe it happens in 20 years, but not in the next 2 decades.
Okay.
Yeah. It sounds like that Marius.
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to say also two things. So first, Anton mentioned that I was sort of portraying a picture of the new partisan politics of the welfare state, and I think that's to a certain extent right, and it goes along with some things that Silja has said, that this force of public opinion can actually be quite a powerful force for change, and I think Maurizio's data actually shows that quite impressively, because what my criticism of the Pearsonian perspective on policy feedback and institutional change would be is that there is not a lot of potential for endogenous change, if you want to put it like that, because somehow people's preferences, people's attitudes towards the welfare state are very much oriented towards the status quo. So where would change come from? So there is not a lot of leeway for new things to happen. And actually, if you look at the data, and Maurizio showed this quite impressively, and I also did a survey a couple of years ago where we just published a paper in the Journal of European Social Policy on this, where we also find that in many countries people demand things that are very different from the status quo. And in our case, we looked at education policy, and we find that support for spending on vocational education and training in particular is very high in many European countries that have traditionally not been very strong in vocational education and training. So there is a potential for public opinion to become, to a certain extent, independent of the status quo. And I think, especially in Europe, people actually do look across the border and see what's happening in other countries, and they see, okay, well, Germany has a pretty good apprenticeship system, so maybe we should do something about this. It's not totally predetermined what countries are doing. So I think that in many ways public opinion can become an important driving force. But the second thing I wanted to, very short, to add on the second dimension thing, and I totally agree with Silja that we should pay more attention to this, but I'm a little bit doubtful whether you made this point very strongly that the first dimension is all about redistribution, the second dimension is more about values. I think there's an underlying redistributive dimension in all of this. Yes. So even the second dimension is very much about redistribution, namely cross-national redistribution that Maurizio was talking about. It's about who gets what kind of size, what kind of pie, what size of the pie. Redistribution is also very important for the second dimension, and we need to figure out, I guess, to what extent this is then connected to value conflicts.
Maurizio, there's a room for short.
Just 3 remarks. First, I think that the discussion about social investment is sometimes put in as if social investment was really an alternative to what we already have, or to the traditional approach. I remember having discussions on this with my friend Bea Cantillon, who is somewhat critical about social investment, because she thinks that emphasizing too much this runs the risk of what Silja was saying, of dualizing. So I think that social investment should not be seen as an alternative, but as an option in a menu which includes 3 missions. One is social insurance, as we know it, which needs to be modernized and to some extent recalibrated, but still needs to be there. Then social investment. And then we have a third mission, which is, I now call it loser support. We discussed it with Bea in Brussels, and we couldn't find a name for this, so we just left a question mark. That is to say, new policies that are aimed at really helping those people who are left behind by the social insurance traditional schemes, because their contingencies are not envisaged by those systems, that are too old or too weak, are not suitable for policy, for social investment measures, and need emergency support to, also in terms of relocation from one sector to the other. They are low skilled, they are old or mature workers. So these 3 missions.
Okay.
No, I had 2 other points, but...
Yeah, I know, and many, many more. But now it's time for you to see if we have any questions, or we have a microphone there. So
My name is Mieke Verloo, Radboud University.
Is this thing actually on? I can.
Is it on? Is it
no,
better?
it is.
Okay. Mieke Verloo, Radboud University. I was very pleased to hear from the both last speakers that there is so much potential for support for welfare state elements in different ways. But most of the examples that were mentioned are about a particular part of Europe called Western Europe. So especially, for instance, the last slide of Silja Häusermann was a slide about data from 2006 about Western Europe showing unanimous support for pension and education. Can you and can Mr. Ferrera maybe say anything about whether this support varies across Europe and what are the reasons if that is the case? Thank you.
Shall we collect a few questions? So I saw they're up there.
Thank you very much, Peter Fijn, Wageningen University, the Netherlands. Thanks for the panel, which was much more elevating than I had expected. But I was wondering how the idea about the European cross-solidarity chimes with the experience in some southern European countries. I'm thinking here about Greece, Spain, Portugal, where the European Union has been rather experienced as the agent of the abolishment or weakening of the welfare state.
Okay. Let's take one more, if there is one. If not, no. Where? Yeah. Here on the front. There's a microphone.
No, thank you very much for a very interesting panel discussion. So my kind of question is broader. I wonder, do we need a conceptual revolution in the study of the welfare state? I think a lot of the indicators and measures that we use just don't match up anymore. And I think you see that in Silja's presentation about, the kind of the realignment of Western politics. Even when I listen to welfare state scholarship and I think about my own background, I think about my day-to-day conversations with people on the bus, they don't match up. Mm-hmm. They just don't link together. And I just wonder whether we need to really rethink the core concepts that we use here. But I have a particular question for Silja. Do we need to distinguish between the poor and the working class in these measures?
Sorry, can you...
Do we need to distinguish between the poor and the working class?
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So, who would like to... The European variation, Eastern Europe? Yeah.
You want to say something?
I can go. I'm sorry, I don't have the same numbers for the Eastern European countries. I mean, overall, the variation in these questions there you are. Sorry, in the ISSP, when we ask these questions whether people support education spending, or even when we ask whether it's the state's responsibility to support education, pensions, etc., just the support is extremely high, and I think across the board. I think Marius, you also have worked on that a lot, and of course there are variations, but very few ones. And I don't have it ready here, but I think it's the same in Eastern Europe. But I think that points actually to. I think on the one hand it captures a reality that people are not lying. People support these policies. But it also points at the weakness of our indicators that we use to work with. Because, as Aidan just said, I mean, of course, that doesn't match up with the political questions that are then debated. And I think one of the good things in our discipline is now that implementing surveys has become so accessible and so much easier than it was 10 years ago, that this conceptual and measurement revolution that you claim should be feasible. But it needs to be thought through first, because it's not obvious.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's.
Thanks, Marius, on this.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a small point. I think in the literature on welfare state attitudes, you have this distinction between abstract and concrete attitudes, and what that means is that the abstract attitudes is, do you like the welfare state, do you support the basic principles, and so on. And there you see, as Silja pointed out, not a lot of cross-national variation. So a lot of people, even in the US, like the basic principles of the welfare state, but there is a lot of variation when it comes to the concrete implementation. And again, again, people are actually also recognizing when something is not really working that well, and when you have concrete attitudes on the performance of the welfare state, that might look very different. It's the challenge for policymakers is to get a better performance, I guess, of the welfare state on the basis of the relatively high abstract support for the welfare state. But and also I think not only about European countries, we should also think more about the US, because there is a certain tendency also here on this panel, I guess naturally, to just to conduct this debate as an inter-European debate. And I think in the US the situation looks quite different and looking increasingly more different. And Anton mentioned it briefly, and would be interested in also hearing your thoughts, because I think they are definitely on a trajectory that is not so optimistic, I would say, compared to Europe.
No, I think that the work of Pearson and Hacker on policy drift in the US is a case in point. What is interesting about North America is that, again, looking at spending indicators and looking at employment indicators in particular, is that Canada is moving towards Europe. And within Canada, Quebec, which used to be sort of, quite behind sort of a Bismarckian welfare state in this sort of, liberal welfare state, is actually moving ahead of the other provinces on the same ticket. And there's something, I think, special about the way we talk and think about the welfare state, and it reflects a situation in the US very much, is that, on the face of it, if you look at Obama healthcare, that's just an improved insurance mechanism. It will lead to lower costs and higher longevity and more people insured. But it's framed in the political debate as a distributive issue. So I'm always a bit wary when we too quickly jump the debate from social insurance to redistribution, exactly because of this. And, politics is about many things. So, 5 years ago, one would think, given sort of the educational expenses that went into Poland, and also family policies, that actually Poland was kind of latching up to this. But then something else happened. Something else became more important in the Polish context. And so, politics is not all about the welfare state. It has to do with the welfare state. And then on Southern Europe, I think here is a very serious cleavage, because if it's the case, if the social investment multiplier works for, let's say, Germany, and that accelerates employment growth, which allows for more investment in families and what have you, then Germany will be like Scandinavia. Now, if at the same time that by Germany, Italy is being told, for the next 20 years, you have to be austerity, because that's what we did, in the early 2000s. Then, I was trained as an economist. Then I think you cannot have the euro. It will, because the euro is only good if it leads to some kind of convergence. But if it enforces divergence, you have to cut it loose. And this is why, what Maurizio says is so important, that somehow we have to sort of, breach the gap that has been created.
Let him speak for himself.
Yes.
Yes. On public opinion and on survey data, in our survey we only have Poland. And Poland doesn't really stand out as being anomalous in terms of the types, the general direction of the responses that were given. Polls were a little bit more open in terms of free movement, as one would have expected. They support the fact that there shouldn't be discrimination in terms of access to the labor market or access to benefits. And they were a little bit less supportive of cross-national transfers, okay? Probably they count on the current system of cross-national transfers, which is in place, because it brings already some resources to them, and they tend to side with core countries when it comes to the north-south divide. An interesting development, if you compare responses now with responses a few years ago from similar surveys, is that polls have seem to have become less keen on pushing the European Union towards market correcting. I mean, a social Europe. And the increase of polls that say that the mission of the EU should be just making a common market and supporting free movement has increased over time. Okay? And that, of course, we need analysis to understand what it means, really, also in terms of politics. As to Southern Europe, okay, in Southern Europe, the European Union and the process of European integration for a long time was seen, perceived, and lived as a gentle force for modernization and catching up, okay? And of course, during the crisis, austerity, the troika, the bailouts, the conditionality, all this have actually gone in the opposite direction. And if you, in my survey, I only have Spain, and Spain comes out as expected as the country in which people are more afraid that the process of European integration leads to losses in social benefits and also jobs. Despite this, Spaniards remain very supportive of integration, of the process of European integration as such. So on the integration scale, they remain very much pro-Europe, but at the same time, they also are the respondents that are more supportive of an incisive social turn of the process of integration, okay? So there's clearly, they still trust the European Union, but not the European Union that they've experienced in the last few years, but a European Union that becomes much more socially friendly.
Thank you very much. And with that, I would like to conclude and thanking the members of the Roundtable and you as an audience for your attention.